Oh my gosh, that's disgusting. Oh, it's squishy. What's going on, guys? Welcome to another episode. In today's video, I'm going to be showing you guys how to change over all of the fluids that you have in your manual transmission vehicle. So I'm going to be going over all the fluids. So your engine oil, your transmission, your differential, your brakes, your power steering, and your clutch. All of that is going to get changed over today, and I'm going to show you how to get it done. So everything that you guys see here today is going to be able to get me to swap over the fluids that I have in my car for some upgraded, better fluid that's going to be able to withstand higher temperatures. So I'm going to be starting off over here on the left with some oil filters and oil itself. So this Nissan 370Z that you guys see behind here recommends 5W30 engine oil and an OEM filter. So this here is the OEM filter. It does the trick, it's not bad, but there are definitely better filters out there. So more often than not, car companies make stuff to just get by. So OEM is decent, but it's not great. So from there are many other options like K&N. This here is a very good, very inexpensive oil filter. That's the part number there. And you can get the same kind of thing from Fram, from Purolator. However, it's still not going to be anywhere near as good as an upgraded part like this. This is a Nismo oil filter. This is compatible with any Z, any of the S chassis vehicles, and a whole bunch more. I'll link this stuff in the description box. Now, as for the oil itself, this here is 5W40. This Z recommends 530, but one thing that these Zs are notorious for is having engine overheating issues. So the engine oil gets super hot and super heated up when you go to the track, and even when you drive it on the street. That's why I'm changing it out to this Motul 300V 5W40 fluid. So that means that when it's at lower temperatures, it has the same viscosity, but when it gets heated, it actually acts as a thicker engine oil, which means it can withstand more heat while giving really good engine oil pressure. Now, from Motul, they also sell other fluids like gear oil in multiple different viscosities, along with brake fluid. So for the transmission, I'm going to be changing over the fluid that's in my car for 75W90 gear oil. So it requires 2.8 liters of it. I have a little bit more than that just to get me by. And this is going to allow me to change out the fluid that has been in my car since 2014. So this fluid is going to get changed over. There's no other filters that need to be done for this car. So that is a nice upgrade. Now for the differential, the VLSD is notorious for acting as an open differential once it's heated up. So this fluid right here is thicker than the OEM spec. The OEM spec fluid is 75W90. However, if you want to get a little bit more out of your car, you can get something like this here from Motul as well, or any other company for that matter, but you want to switch to a thicker viscosity. So only the second number needs to be larger. Now, as for the brakes, this here is an upgraded brake fluid from Motul as well. This is a DOT4 brake fluid. Now, the really cool thing about this is that not only does it have a higher boiling point than the factory fluid, but the DOT4 fluid here will not corrode paint. So if you have powder-coated or painted brake calipers, it's not going to ruin the finish of it. And the same thing, let's say if it gets on any kind of body part. It's safe. I would still recommend rinsing it off with water or some kind of brake cleaner, but you'll at least know that you'll have some peace of mind. Now, last but not least, let's talk about the power steering fluid. So this here is a synthetic fluid that you can swap out into your power steering system, but what's actually an upgrade over that is this here. This is an automatic transmission fluid, fully synthetic, also from Redline. This is the D6. If you guys have a Z or a G, this is what I would recommend. You can also look it up in the OEM service manual. You can run automatic transmission fluid. So that is what I'm doing. So to get all this stuff done, you can use regular hand tools that you'll find at home. I have a wrench here. You're gonna need some hex bits. You're gonna need a wrench. I have a 10 mil right there. You're gonna need some pumps and everything that you need to get your car safely jacked up in the air and then you can work on it. A creeper like this is also gonna be really helpful to get underneath the car should you be working on the ground. Removing all of your old engine oil and swapping it out for new fluids along with your filter is not a difficult process. If you guys are very new to cars, this is probably gonna be the first thing that you guys are gonna wanna try and do on your car. So by changing out the fluids on it, you're just staying on top of the regular maintenance. Now, as for the actual oil change for this car, it's a little bit different. So typically whenever you go underneath the car for an oil change, you just go underneath, you pop the drain bolt out, you unscrew the oil filter, and then you install a new filter and then put in the new fluid. For this car, there's a couple under tray pieces, and there's something else that I installed on the car that is a little bit special, and it helps the car run a little bit cleaner. Now let me show you what that is. So before changing over all of our fluids, it's very important that your car is supported on jack stands and they're at the same level. Ensuring that the car is level allows the engine oil, the transmission, and the differential to properly be bled out. It allows the fluid to be changed over, and it makes it so that you don't actually overfill or underfill any of these systems. So using a 10 mil and an impact, I'm gonna go underneath the car and zap out the 16 10 mil bolts that are securing the lower plastic shield into place. They're found all along the perimeter of it. With the under tray removed, it will expose the entire bottom side of the engine. Now, I've already done an oil change on my car before, hence why you can see that I have a different color drain plug, and my oil filter has a little interesting piece on it. So as preventative maintenance, when I did my last oil change, I changed out the filter and I changed out all the oil, but I also installed this tool right here, which is called a filter mag, and I also installed a magnetic drain plug in hopes of preventing the metal particulates that are floating around inside the engine oil. I wanted to adhere those to either the drain plug or this here, which is attached to the oil filter. I don't need to do an oil change on my car, but if I were to do it, this is how it would be done. So with the car in the air, you're going to want to remove the drain plug and you're going to want to catch all the oil that is sitting inside the oil pan. With it fully drained, you're then going to use an oil filter wrench to take off the oil filter that's attached to this housing here. Then with your new oil filter, you're going to want to pre-fill this as much as possible so that the filter media can actually have oil inside there, so that when you turn your car on for the first time, you're not going to be starving all of your bearings of oil. On another note, you also want to ensure that you lubricate this O-ring here, and the other O-ring from the previous oil filter that's on the car, you want to ensure that that comes out so that you don't have seal on top of seal when you install this new one. You grab the filter mag and attach it to the side of the metal oil filter. Then thread on the oil filter along with a new crush washer for your drain plug, and then fill the system up with fresh engine oil. So the little earth magnets that are found inside the filter mag make it so that any metal that's floating around in the engine oil is going to want to stay adhered inside the oil filter. And that way it doesn't circulate inside the engine and it doesn't kill anything. So getting something like this is just one sort of thing that you can do as preventative maintenance to ensure that your engine lasts a long time. So I did this filter magnet along with a magnetic drain plug. Both of those combined are going to allow any kind of metal that's inside the system, that's inside the oil, to stick to here and come out every oil change. It's a little bit more insurance when you're working with an engine, especially one that you're beating on. So moving down the driveline, the next part that we're going to be replacing is going to be the fluid for the transmission. Now, as I mentioned earlier, it is a stock 75W90 fluid. If you guys are dealing with overheating problems, you can upgrade to something like this where it's a little bit thicker. This is what I'll be putting inside the differential. So before getting started, ensure that you have a pump to get the fluid transferred from inside the bottle to the vehicle. You're going to need a 10 mil hex socket like this, and you're also going to need some new crush washers for the drain bolts that we're going to be removing. So you're going to need 2 of them for the diff and 2 for the transmission, 1 for the fill and then another one for the drain. So before removing the drain bolt on the bottom side of the transmission, you're first going to want to go on the side of the transmission where the fill bolt is and ensure that you can remove it, because if you can't put new fluid in, you shouldn't be taking the old fluid out. So using an M10 hex bit and a wrench, crack the fill bolt loose. Following that, use the same socket and wrench to crack the drain bolt loose and remove the drain bolt completely. This fluid doesn't look too bad, but considering I've tracked the car on the OEM fluid, it's not a bad time to replace it. With the transmission draining, we can take off the old crush washer that's found on the drain bolt and replace it with a new one. When you torque the bolt to the transmission housing, the soft crush washer will deform and make a tight seal, ensuring you don't have any leaks. You're going to want to repeat the same thing to the identical fill bolt, as it has a crush washer on it as well. I'll link this assorted set of crush washers in the description box, as it's much cheaper than buying individual ones from the dealership. With all the fluid evacuated, you can fasten the drain bolt and torque it to 25 foot-pounds. Using this fluid transfer pump, thread it onto the top of the Motul bottle and unthread the pump from the base. You're pretty much ready to go. So underneath the car, put the hose and clamp into this fill port on the passenger side of the transmission. With it secured, pump all the fluid that's inside the bottle until it's emptied. Since the hose is clear, you should be able to see the fresh fluid being transferred from the bottle to the trans. It shouldn't take too long to get it to where the hose is sucking in air. That just means that you need to swap it out for another fresh bottle of fluid. You can also see on the side of the bottle how much fluid is left in there as a reference. Given my car takes 2.8 liters, the third bottle will do it for me. Keep pumping the fluid until you see it coming out of the fill port. That means that the transmission has the proper amount of fluid in it. Remove the clamp and hose and install the fill plug with its new crush washer. Torque the fill port to 25 foot-pounds and you're done. So next up, we're going to be transferring this fluid into the diff. So first things first, we need to use the ratchet and the M10 socket just like before, and we're going to take out all the old fluid. So just like the transmission, first the fill, then the drain. From the back side of the car, on the cover, you can see there's the drain bolt, and on the side of the cover, there's the fill bolt. Changing over the fluid in the differential is very similar to swapping out the fluid in the trans. Using the same 10mm hex bolt, crack the fill bolt loose and then do the same to the drain. After you take the lower drain bolt out, you can inspect the color and the viscosity of the fluid when it drains. And as you can tell, this is much worse than the transmission. This fluid is a lot darker and much thicker than it should be. The diff fluid should look identical to the transmission fluid because they're both the same fluids. So while I let the differential drain, take a look at this. So this is the drain plug from the differential, and you can tell that there's a bunch of like soot and crap on it. This, all like the little thick parts, I'm gonna get the camera to focus on this. All of that stuff is metal particulates attached to the magnet, and it's stuck and clung on there with the oil as well. So, ready? Fresh blue towel. Let's see if we can clean this all off. Oh my gosh, that's disgusting. Oh, it's squishy. Oh, look at that. Disgusting. And to think that this here is on a car that has 40,000 kilometers on it. Guys, go change your diff fluid. So just to show you, this is what it should look like. Not like what we had before. So that is all from the magnet. And luckily, this was there because otherwise all that metal that you see right there, that big clump, that would all be floating around inside the diff and could potentially destroy it. So magnetic drain plugs, 100% worth it. Before putting the new crush washer on the drain plug, ensure you take the old one off. Slide a new copper crush washer on the plug and grab the thicker 75W140 fluid attached to the same pump that we used before. Thread the drain plug onto the differential by hand and then torque it to 26 foot-pounds. You can then begin to feed the differential of its new fluid. And the cool thing about the 75W140 from Motul is that the fluid is blue. Should your fluid ever leak, it makes it really easy to diagnose due to its vibrant color. Since my diff requires 1.4 liters of oil, you can go full send on the first bottle and not have to worry about any oil overflowing through the fill port until you get to the second. Pump away until it's emptied. When you move on to the second liter, take your time with it as it will overflow rather soon. As soon as it starts to, grab your fill plug with a new crush washer and thread it onto the differential. Lastly, torque the fill plug to 26 foot-pounds. So following the differential and the transmission, we're going to be working on the clutch and the brake system. So we're going to be using this fluid here for both of them. This is Motul RBF 660. As I mentioned earlier, it's a .4 brake fluid. Now this fluid can be used interchangeably in a system that runs DOT3 or 4. So hence why we're going to be switching out to this product here. This has a much higher boiling point, which means should we beat on our brakes or the clutch system, the fluid isn't going to boil. Now to make this basically a one-man job, I'm going to be using this vacuum brake bleeder. You can use this for your brake system or your clutch system. It's from this company here, Capri Tools. I've used this and I've shown this to you guys before on a New Tool Tuesday video. If you guys want to find that, you'll find a link right here. But I'm going to be showing you guys right now how to change both of these fluids out. We're going to be starting off with the clutch. So we're going to go underneath the car with a 10 mil, and we're going to swap out the brake fluid that's inside the system now for this new stuff. So on the driver's side of the transmission, you'll find the clutch line that feeds the internal clutch slave cylinder, which is found inside the transmission bell housing. So you have the inlet and the bleeder screw, and the bleeder right here has an 8mm head. You want to first crack it loose to ensure it isn't seized, which it isn't, and then tighten it back up. Following that, underneath the hood, we can inspect the master cylinders for both the brakes and the clutch. So since I just installed some stainless braided brake lines, I don't have any fluid in the lines, which is why the master is empty. The clutch master isn't, but you can see the DOT3 fluid is pretty dark, which isn't good. So if you squeeze the trigger on this fluid extractor from Capri Tools, we can remove all the fluid from the master to prevent us from pushing all that dirty fluid through the lines. Take a look at the remains that have settled to the bottom of the reservoir. Now is definitely a great time to put new fluid in. Using this RBF 660 DOT4 fluid, fill the reservoir with enough fresh fluid to top it off. You don't want the master to run dry during this bleeding procedure. Underneath the car, slide the 8mm wrench over top of the bleeder screw and then attach the one-man vacuum bleeder over top of it. With the trigger squeezed, crack the bleeder screw loose until you can see the old fluid coming out through the clear line. Since the clutch system doesn't require a lot of fluid, it's very easy to run the master dry, so only do this for a couple seconds, go back to the master, and top it up. After you do this once or twice, all the old fluid should be replaced with fresh DOT4 fluid. Tighten the bleeder screw and put the dust boot back over top. Go back to the master one last time, top it off, and put the filler cap back over top of the reservoir. The fluid should be at the max line on the master cylinder, just like how you see it here. When you go inside the car, the clutch pedal should feel nice and smooth. While we're at it in the engine bay, top up the brake master cylinder because we need fresh fluid inside the system so we can bleed the brakes. With both master cylinders all topped up, if you want to take care of your brake system and bleed it, you're going to have to do it as followed. So you're going to want to bleed the system from the furthest from the ABS pump as possible, and then you're going to work your way closest to it. Now, for whatever reason, if your car, let's say, doesn't have ABS, you're only going to do it from furthest from the master as possible, and then work your way closest to that. So it's typically passenger rear, passenger front, driver front. For whatever reason though, on my Nissan behind me, the bleed order is different than that. So I'm going to start off by bleeding passenger rear, driver front, driver rear, and then passenger front. That's the order that the factory service manual recommends bleeding this system. However, more often than not, it's not like that. So let's get started on the back corner. All of the brake calipers on this car have 2 bleeder screws, while most cars only have 1. By cracking each bleeder loose and pulling the air and fluid from the lines, it will allow the fluid from the master to be pulled into each of the brake lines and fill the calipers, which will eliminate all of the air and sponginess to your brakes. If your calipers have 2 bleeder screws just like these, you would initially bleed the outside screw and then the inner one. You want to keep bleeding the lines until you no longer see any air coming out of them. Moving on to the driver front, begin by cracking loose the outer bleeder screw and pulling as much of the old fluid and air out as possible. Then follow by the inside bleeder screw. This process isn't difficult, but it is tedious. It can also be time consuming should you not be able to bleed the brakes yourself. Typically, you would need 2 people to do this job, one person to pump the brakes and the other to open and close the bleeder screws. The traditional way of doing it would be pushing the brakes down, opening the bleeder screw to let the air and fluid out, closing the bleeder screw, letting up on the brake pedal, and then repeating. You can get by without having one of these vacuum-operated extractors, but it makes it so much easier and so much faster. Crack the one bleeder loose, suck out all the air and fluid, close it up, and repeat the same thing for the other bleeder. Don't run the master dry though. So after you bleed each caliper, grab your brake fluid and top it up. If you pull any air into your brake lines, you'll have to do this entire brake bleeding procedure all over again. Fill the master to the max line and install the filler cap. The next fluid to get changed over is going to be the power steering fluid. I run a synthetic power steering fluid in all my cars as it can take much more heat than conventional fluids. Whenever you turn your steering wheel from one side to another, the power steering works the fluid, which in turn heats it up. The synthetic fluid does a very good job at not breaking down over time, which means you'll most likely won't have to replace your rack or pump due to it failing and overheating. Right here I have a full synthetic automatic transmission fluid that I'll be putting in my Z. The reservoir cap recommends using Dextron type ATF fluid instead of the traditional hydraulic power steering fluid. This D6 fluid will be perfect for my car. If you guys have a Z or a G and you guys go through power steering pumps, changing over to a fluid like this would be my first bet. So with the extractor hooked up to my air line and air compressor, pull off the attachment for the bleeder screws off the line and remove as much fluid as possible from the reservoir. Then, with the new fluid, fill the reservoir to the fill line and put the cap back on. Now this part here has to be done on the ground. Turn the wheel from lock to lock. That will make your power steering pump work the fluid and cycle it from the reservoir to the rack and back and forth. After you do this a couple times, go back to the engine bay and suck out all the fluid that you can get from the reservoir and replace it with all new fresh fluid. You may have to do this a couple of times, but I find this process and procedure much easier than disconnecting any lines going to and from the rack or to and from the reservoir, and then following up by bleeding the entire system. Lastly, the only other fluid on this car to be changed over is going to be the engine coolant. It's what regulates the temperature of the engine. It does that by circulating throughout the engine and it sheds off heat by then passing the coolant through the radiator. If you go under your car to check out the radiator, you'll find a little valve on the bottom side of it. Now that little valve is called a petcock, and it allows the cooling system to be drained relatively easily. Depending on the system, you either have to fully unthread it or rotate it 90 degrees to allow the fluid to flow through it and fully drain. This won't get all the coolant out of the system, but it will get a good majority of it. After you let it fully drain, tighten the petcock back up to the radiator, and then we can go ahead and bleed the system. The easiest way that I find to do this is using a bleeder tool that attaches to the top of the radiator or rad cap, as you can simply fill the funnel up with coolant, and the exact amount of coolant you need will enter the system. You have to turn your car on and let it idle with the heat on the interior of the car set to max, which will cycle the coolant through the heater core that's found inside the cabin. You want to get your car up to operating temperatures so that it fully bleeds. You then should shut off the car and let the coolant enter the system. That will have bled and purged the system entirely. Plug the funnel so that you can remove it and reinstall the rad cap. That will then complete every fluid change on your manual transmission vehicle. Don't forget to mark down on a piece of paper your odometer and make sure that you stay up to date with your service intervals now that you're starting fresh. So with the Z now down on the ground and all the fluids topped up, the Z is ready to go. Now before I can actually give you guys an idea as to how this all feels, I need to get the fluids up to operating temperature, I need to get the tires warmed up, and I need to get the new brake pads and everything all bedded. So in a previous video I showed you guys how to install all those brakes, and I haven't taken it for a spin yet. I need to do that so I can properly test out how all this new stuff has reacted and how it's positively or negatively affected the Z. In theory, it should be positive, but we'll get into that in a future video. If you guys want to find any of the tools, any of the fluids, anything you guys saw in this video, including torque specs, you can find all that in the description box. Thank you guys as always. Now, I know you guys have been really patient. I have had some hiccups with the Accord and the new engine that's being built for it. The engine is now pretty much done-ish, which is fantastic news, and I've got some footage for you guys, and it is really exciting stuff. So the new K24 engine is ready to be put back together, and it's time to make some power out of that thing. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you guys like what you guys see, be sure to give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to the channel if you guys aren't subscribed. Otherwise, guys, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.